everybody. Welcome to the best session slot of the whole conference, because we know if you're here, you really care about this topic. So thank you for coming. Let's see, we're a small group, so if y'all are comfortable moving in closer, make us feel a little less alone up here.
Thank you.
Do y'all still want to use microphones? We can keep the mics, but we can also make this a great discussion since we're a small group today. So thank you for coming. I'm Margaret Morales. I work at Trellis Group, and I lead the carbon program there. So Trellis is a company that supports corporate sustainability teams. And so what that means for me is I spend a lot of time talking to carbon buyers. And as everyone in this room can totally imagine, I'm sure, what they want to talk about is risk. If they're thinking about buying carbon credits or they do buy carbon credits, they're concerned about risk. And they're concerned about two kinds of risk. Reputation, of course, that comes up in basically every meeting I run. And then the risk, and it's not always framed as risk, but it's like, is this thing actually having an impact, and how do I know? Because a carbon credit, I've heard it described as a credence good, which is to say, it's really hard to know if it worked, even after you bought it. I don't know anything about cars, and so if I take my car to the mechanic, he's gonna do something, and I have no idea if he did anything good to my car, or if it's gonna blow up, in a year. I have no idea. So carbon credits are a little like that if you're not a deep expert. So this session is talking about risk, and how do we think about that, and how do we manage that, and when do we overmanage that? So with that, I have three wonderful experts with me to talk about this. We have Racheal Notto from KEDA. She's the head of carbon markets. Katharyn Duffy directs the science program at Vibrant Planet, which supports land use management decisions. And we have Leslie Dershinger. Did I do that all right? Who's the founder and CEO of Terra Global Capital, which helps direct finance to nature-based projects, carbon projects. So 3 different perspectives on this conversation about risk. And I told them I'm going to start off asking the question, and we're going to start with you, Racheal, and go down the line. The question is, what do you believe about risk when it comes to carbon projects that no one else believes, or that at least is not a widely held belief? So kick us off with that. What is your hot take? Racheal, start.
Thank you very much for hosting this panel today, Margaret. And kicking off, it's going to sound super loaded because I work for a carbon insurance company. So it's more of on my personal reflection rather than KEDA. But I actually do believe that carbon insurance is beneficial to the market. And I say that as a convert to insurance. My background is not insurance. My background is environmental science and climate policy. And when I first heard about carbon insurance, which was a few years ago now, I was at a large project developer managing their portfolio for all of the Americas. And someone had mentioned that to me, and I was like, carbon insurance, we don't need that. Like, what do you mean? Get out of here. I literally just sat there and thought about it for 2 more seconds, and I was like, oh, I see now how this is actually gonna close a lot of the gaps that my day-to-day I'm very concerned about in terms of all types of risks. And so that is kind of my not hot take, is that I do actually think carbon insurance is beneficial to the voluntary carbon market.
Okay, what about you, Katharyn?
Yeah, well, I think it's okay to be biased to our own perspectives because it's our belief or opinion, right? So as a scientist, I'd say my hypothesis is that some of the combination of our current data revolution, a lot of the topics that we've been seeing in this conference thus far, everything from remote sensing to AI, et cetera, in combination with a lot of the evolving generation of methods around dynamic performance benchmarks and other ways to sort of chip away at this uncertainty or risk can actually really serve nature-based solutions and really support them as a bridge as we think about additional technologies that are under development and coming online.
Great. Well, Terra Global, we both invest in projects, so we run an investment fund. We do oversee and support our local partners in implementing activities on the ground, And in addition, we do the carbon development under market standards. So we sort of get involved in heavily, definitely on the financing side and on the carbon development side, but even in some of the support on the ground. And I would say, like, there's a lot of risks to talk about, which I think we'll talk about later, but the one thing that maybe others don't think about is the information asymmetry. So when you think about who our investees are, they're generally governments or local community groups, and we're doing a financial transaction in what will be a financial asset. And the information asymmetry, where they know what needs to happen on the ground, they know why they're using natural resources the way they do, but understanding clearly what their obligations are, what's the financial transaction look like, what are the ongoing responsibilities to be part of a private sector climate finance investment, and then what is a fair deal terms, right? What are fair deal terms? I think unless we can close that information asymmetry and see each other and understand each other on a fairly clear basis and see both sides, it can create real risk, right? Because if somebody thinks they're getting into something that's different than they ended up getting into, they're not going to keep doing what they're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. So I think on the one we don't think about, that'd probably be the one that I would list.
All right, thank you. Good little teaser. So as Leslie mentioned, there's so many kinds of risk, and they overlap and they influence each other. And we're going to try to talk about a lot of them. But I thought the way we could start this conversation is thinking a little bit about the life cycle of a carbon credit, and starting with the earliest stages of development. What are the kinds of risk that decisions you make in the first, months of developing a project influence that project and its risk for years, decades to come? So I wanted to ask, and I want to start with you on this, Katharyn. What risks sort of are baked into projects at an early stage, and how do you see people you work with mitigating those or blind to those?
Yeah, great question. And, my bias is going to be nature-based solutions because that's the space I'm working in. But the first place that my head goes, and one that I see propagate into risk as people are citing and developing projects, is the fact that in nature-based solutions, we're living and working with and in a living, breathing system that is undergoing disturbance all the time, every day. And that disturbance might be building a new housing community, right? That disturbance might be a wildfire. That disturbance might be a hurricane or blowdown event. And unless we have the information and the data to interact with that in real time, we're going to be placing projects that might have been improved forest management in a fire scar. We might be doing a conservation easement in a place that is actually under active development. And so real-time data is the first sort of, in my mind, foundation of how do we think about where to do something and why. I think the next part of it is, okay, so now we have real-time information. There's one more ingredient. And I think this is one that is probably the next generation in this dynamic performance benchmark family of methodologies, one that is not yet out, which is that we can look at historical time series, right, and say, what has been the performance of X, Y, or Z approach? That could be afforestation, reforestation, that could be RED, that could be improved forest management, you name it, and say, how have these done under extreme circumstances, under an extreme drought, under wildfire, under project development? And so I think those are like the two places, as a data scientist, my answer is data, of course, right? But I think that those data bring important information to bear as we think about that project development. And in the absence of that information, we can unintentionally cite something in a place that might be at very high risk.
Okay, thank you. What about you, Racheal? What do you have to add?
I have one stat to add and then a specific risk that I'd like to highlight. So the first one is pre-validation risk. Obviously makes up a bunch of different types within that. Katharyn just started touching on it. I'm going to look at it from the legal side. But pre-validation risk, like just the fact of a project getting to validation, we at KETA, we did a project with Clear Blue Markets last year, where Clear Blue Markets actually analyzed across 3 of the big 4 registries how many projects that were actually got listed on the registry and then made it to the validation stage. And it was like 1 in 20 and that are actually making it into validation. So that's huge. And that's just the projects that are actually getting listed on the registry. That doesn't even count the projects that project developers had really great ideas for and for whatever reason didn't even make it out the door. Probably to no one's fault specifically either. So I just want to shout out that stat of really how big that pre-validation risk is. And then one of the ones that I want to underscore within that realm of risk is the project developers' relationships with the governments where the project is located, whether that's at the local level, at the regional level, national, jurisdictional. All of that's super, super important. And on Tuesday, we did a panel on the legal nature of carbon credits, and part of that is around the land rights and the carbon rights. And regardless of the type of project that you have, if you don't have the carbon rights for the project secured, then you don't have any carbon credits to be able to officially sell, honestly. So, and that's why I say the relationship management and the correct engagement with the appropriate governmental entities where that project is located, absolutely critical. And honestly, most project developers are very well connected with those correct governmental entities because they understand how important it is too. But just like the U.S. right now, every few years you might have the rug pulled out from under you, again, to no fault of the project developer. So I think that's a really critical one for the pre-validation risk.
Interesting. Okay, if you're going to analyze land rights, what do you look for in a project to determine, they have really high risk of, not actually having rights to the carbon credits? Are you looking for partnerships, or what do you look for?
I will disclose I do not have a law background. My colleague James Kench is in the audience. He does. So if you have specific questions on this afterwards, he's a great guy to go to. But to quickly get to that point, it's looking at who really holds the title to the land. I am currently going through my first home purchase, so I'm now learning what a title search is like. So that it's the same thing when you're doing a carbon project, that knowing where the title is, who has rights to that title, is that title secured by who says they actually have it, or is somehow that land actually the government's and it's a public park and you don't actually have the rights to do that. So the title of the land is one of the key ones to my knowledge.
Okay, Leslie, you bring finance to projects, you bring capital. So how early in the project life cycle do you get involved, and what risks are you looking for at that stage?
So it's a good follow-on for both the sort of biophysical ones that you highlighted and then bringing up government relations and tenure. So we get involved at the very start. We have a process where we build collaboratively with the investee the business case, and then if the business case makes sense, meaning that the plan of what they want to do, how much it's going to cost, what are the carbon estimates, who would be implementing, what is the land tenure, how do we secure carbon tenure, all of those things are part of the business case and a carbon eligibility assessment. And then if that looks good, we sign up LOI, letter of intent for an investment, and then we move into the investment readiness phase. And it's only after we actually commit to an investment that the true full implementation of activity starts, and also the carbon development. So we're and that could take about 18 months, that whole process. Sometimes it's shorter, sometimes it's longer. There's definitely community engagement before an official investment. Of course, you got to get people on board and so forth. So we do get involved early. I wanted to add on to the comment about carbon tenure. So we do a tenure analysis on every single project we do, and we cannot invest in something that doesn't have legally recognized land and natural resource tenure. Tenure is not title, but in some cases it is title. A few of ours have private title. Some farmers can get private title, for example, in our Senegal project. And then in some countries, and we've seen it evolving more and more, there is clarity on if you have a certain kind of tenure for land, then that means you have carbon tenure. But in most cases, still, the majority of the countries we work in and invest in, even with land tenure, you don't don't necessarily have carbon tenure. So that's where we use the belt and suspenders approach to managing risk, is anyone we think that could have a claim on carbon, which generally includes the government, is in some way, shape, or form engaged. And it depends on what the tenure is, and it depends on the law. And sometimes it's the government who's actually our investee, so that makes it nice. But in that case, the way that we look at the risks is if they're not devolving that benefit of having carbon tenure to those who have land tenure, so when there's a mismatch, then you have risk of the fact that no one that has that tenure is going to want to do anything that you want to do. So I'll leave it at that, because I could talk forever about carbon tenure and that kind of thing, and it is absolutely a key part of, even before a project comes into our pipeline, before we even start that business case, we have to understand the tenure and how we're going to engage those who have tenure and how they're going to be part of the investment and part of the implementation.
Okay, great. All right, so we have a lot of expertise on this panel about nature-based projects in particular. And I think this is a project type that has historically been seen as the most risky, highest risk of reversal, most difficult to figure out if it's additional, is it durable, blah, blah, blah. So I'm curious, what's your take? Are these the most risky projects, and in what way? And Katharyn, I'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I like the in what way part. Because when we say risk, what do we mean? I think there's two types of risk here. There's a risk around a failure of credit delivery, right? And so I think that's where the science part of this grand project has been addressing that and trying to say, okay, let's do dynamic baselines. Let's do ex post dynamic performance benchmark methodologies, right? So that approach creates a different risk. And that risk is, when am I going to get paid? And how much? And how much will this deliver? And so in my mind, we sort of trade one risk for the other. And there's probably some compromise between the two that's essential. But then the last part I'll say about that is that the only thing that's certain in life is death and taxes, right? So everything has risk. NBS projects do have risk. It is a living, breathing, dynamic system. Everything else does as well. Crossing the street, right? Getting the title to your house, you name it. So let's not pretend that every project doesn't have risk. They all do. Has NBS historically had challenges? Absolutely. I think we're bringing ways to address that to bear, but we need to consider both the risk associated with the financial investment with the risk of that credit delivery via more robust methods.
Can I add on to that?
Please.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. That's a really great start to NBS, because we do only NBS too. So sorry, you have a NBS heavy panel here. So when you're dealing with nature-based solutions, we're dealing with people's lives. And even in developed countries, but developing countries, some people are just trying to manage natural resources to feed their families, right? So no matter what, we're going to have risk. Because you're trying to get people to adopt different ways, different livelihoods, different, places to go find their fuel wood to cook their food. So we're always going to have that. I would sort of echo a little bit of what you said on the financial side to say, but is it a good risk return? So if you look at different kind of sectors as an investor, you hope that you're going to find a sector that may have lower risk, but it probably has a lower return. So when we look at the nature-based sector from more of a capitalistic, investment point of view, I feel like even when we have reasonably fair, decent terms with the underlying investees, that we can make a fair risk-adjusted return. So from that perspective, then it gets down to how can we, and we'll maybe talk about this more, how can we mitigate the risks that are there, which are, operational performance risk, which includes everything from, is it designed properly? Because you could implement your work plan beautifully, but if it's not designed in a way to achieve your sort of theory of change and change of how resources are being used, the financial risk, the greenhouse gas quantification and generation risk, and then you had mentioned reputational risk, which is sort of bundled all of that together, but it also has to do with, how much we can help pass down the capacity to manage things on the ground with, as a business, but is treating everybody fairly. And that reputational, and you can never, I would love to have reputational risk insurance. Can you guys work on that? But you're never, no matter what, you're never, even with the great developer, great investee, great project, there's always going to be some reputational risk because honestly, somebody can say something false and that creates, this reputational thing. And in fact, we've seen a lot of that, right? In our sector.
Can I ask a follow-on question? Okay, so Leslie, when you're talking about that sort of return on risk, I think part of what I heard in between the lines is that it's not just the carbon, but the water and the biodiversity and like other benefits that might come into that. Is that true when you're thinking about that sort of risk return evaluation?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that's not what I was saying, but I
Okay.
think it's actually quite important because those are benefits that would accrue to the land tenure holders and those involved in the project, which aren't necessarily financial in nature and may also take a long time to come about. But they are also things that in producing those benefits lower the risk, right? Because their water doesn't dry up. They don't have to walk so far, or maybe their water comes back, right? Or so I think that's a really, of course, because you're a data scientist, thank you for thinking outside of the capitalistic box of investment. Those are good things to bring up, but they're a byproduct that does lower risk, right?
Well, and they probably turn back towards that reputational risk. You don't want to get in the news for developing a carbon project that destroyed a watershed or something like that as well, right? Anyway, sorry for
No,
co-moderating.
that was great. That was great.
And I want to just quickly tack onto that too. What Leslie and what they're exploring here is that there's so many different types of risks out there. There's not one single risk. It is a bundle of risks. And the other part that I think a lot of people forget is that risk is a number and context. And the context to that number is extremely, extremely important because a single number doesn't really mean anything when you're trying to understand if you should make the investment or if you should move forward with a project or anything like that. So the context to the risk is also extremely, extremely important. I think this goes back to the beginning of your question around nature-based solutions as well, is that our in-house data scientist has been recently teaching me around wildfire risk for nature-based projects specifically. She was explaining how in Colombia, yeah, there is a wildfire risk, but actually the wildfire risk is stemming from prescribed burns along grasslands or agricultural features where it just went wrong. And like that's something that can be fixed. That's not just a simple natural issue. Like that is something that you can work with on the ground stakeholders and make sure that the right tools are being used for those prescribed burns and that it's being done at the right time, not when like there's a high drought at that time as well. So I think that's another thing is the context of the specific risk that you're concerned about.
Can you give an example of when is a time when you've had a context that explained a number and maybe changed what insurance you could offer?
Yeah. Okay, so I guess building on, sticking with the nature-based solutions example, a lot of people, rightly so, think about USIFM and the West Coast wildfire risk. And
What is USIFM?
Oh,
Can you
sorry.
just-
Improved forest management. Thank you. So yes, there are every year, we're in California, everyone knows it, there are massive wildfires. And Chloris Geospatial actually had a really, really fantastic presentation Tuesday morning touching on California wildfires. And it showed that the wildfires weren't coming up because of loss of ecosystem or new builds or anything like that. This was for specific wildfires that they were looking at, not all as a whole. And it showed that the peak wildfires were unsurprisingly occurring right after droughts because everything was dry and there was a lot of tinder there. So I think that's something where, yes, there's huge wildfire risk around U.S. improved forest management, but there's ways to manage that. And the type of project that you're investing in or looking at purchasing credits for, that's one of the context components that I think matters.
Okay, thank you.
Can I dovetail on that
Yeah,
one
please
here?
do.
Yeah, I think so. The wildfire risk in California for sure, but the Western U.S. in general is absolutely a mindset that a lot of people said, oh, we can't do IFM, right? My answer is it depends. Of course, classic scientist answer, but it really depends on the type of project and the target. So if we are talking about keeping every single metric ton of carbon in that forest, that the structure of that carbon might be in a form that is likely to be released, is quite volatile. There are other types of forest structures that are quite resilient. You know, California had historic fire return intervals, many areas of 5 or 10 years, right? These are forests that are adapted to that. It's really about how we intersect the strategies in some of these projects with the risks that are headed towards those types of projects. And so I think that just because there's wildfire risk does not mean you can do IFM. It means you might want to do improved forest management, You might want to do improved forest management with an eye towards resilient forest structures in the face of burn probability, of wildfire risk or hazard, et cetera.
Okay, that set us up great for my next question, which is a lot of times when I hear people talk about risk, the pat answer is like, well, technology will save us. We'll just do some more DMRV and Lidar and da-da-da-da-da. So I want to know, what risks can technology solve for and what can they not solve for? And Katharyn, you're our data. Do you want to start with that,
I'll
Leslie?
start, and then you,
Okay.
as you'll come up, you'll fill in. So in the work that we've done, there's, I'd say, 4 examples of technologies that I think have a risk mitigating benefit. One of them is for JRED, so jurisdictional RED programs. It's risk-based modeling of baselines, meaning that if you have a large area, you can say for a smaller area how much risk there was of deforestation and properly allocate a baseline under which someone could get carbon credits. And we do that using, statistical models, using, wall-to-wall, pixel-by-pixel maps. And the reason that it's so cool is because, and why it reduces risk, is because it means that we have the ability to be able to reward those people on the ground who have tenure, who have actually produced the results. So if you have a place that is really far away from the road, someone else is near the road, the person near the road is going to likely have a higher baseline, and that means that the higher emissions, and that means that they can get rewarded if they can actually reduce that. So that's one. And if people get paid for actually doing something that they real, then they're most likely to continue to do it. Another one is sort of, and you may talk more about this, talking about integrating radar and multispectral data. I'm not a data scientist, so I'm going to talk at a conceptual level, but we have a project in Choco, Colombia, you mentioned Colombia, that is under clouds 97% of the time, and 60 or so % of the emissions come from degradation. So not only did we have to figure out how to get through using sensors to do the historic land use change analysis, but we also had to do it for 2 different types of forests, for both open and closed forests. And so why does that matter? It means that if we can do that, and again, we can address the drivers, agents, and underlying causes of deforestation and degradation, they can have a larger revenue stream for actually plowing back down to the ground for people that have done a good job. And then the last one that I think I'll bring up, because you'll have some cool ones, is, you may not think of this as super high technology, but we were able in that same project in Colombia to take our community patrollers who don't read and write, which is fine, they live in the middle of nowhere, they have all kinds of other knowledge, but they got trained to use the SMART app, which a lot of people that know the apps out there, but it was set up in a way that they really didn't have to type letters or anything. And so now we're getting real time, semi-real time, it's not super real time, but much more frequent data about what's happening there, where are they finding issues, lots like different kind of wildlife and those kinds of things. So I feel like that gives us the ability to be more effective at implementing adaptive management, which then lowers our risk. So trying to taking some, those are the 3 examples. So I'll turn it back to you because you got.
I think you should go next because I'll just data dump on everyone.
Perfect. That's a
We'll keep the
fantastic
data up
setup.
till the end.
It's a fantastic setup. So I really want to dig in on the cure-all part. So I don't think technology solutions itself are overhyped because that's a lot of new standardized, regularly updated data for the market. And data for the market is absolutely important. And 25 years ago, there's a lot of data that's coming from these technology solutions that we didn't have, or it was way too expensive. And obviously additional data is really great to see how well or how poor a project is performing. But the cure-all part is definitely the part where I say technology is not a cure-all. It's just another tool to provide more information. But more is more. That doesn't mean it's a good thing. You still need to be able to take that data, do the analysis on it, and understand the insights from that data. And if you don't have the insights from that data, from the new technology tools, then honestly, like, the technology tool that you just bought, like, that's not helping you. That's not advancing anything. So, and as at Kita Insurance Company, insurance is all about data analysis. So we purchase data from so many different types of data providers, remote sensing, MRB, Lidar, everything. Like, we look at it all. And our data scientist team is really the powerhouse for understanding the analysis of that information.
Definitely. I think when I think about this question, I think about, first and foremost, how we are getting the information. So the technological solutions I'm seeing, I almost bucket into, can we see it from space? Yes, no, right? There's that sector of technological innovation, which I think is incredibly powerful, right? We can see, we can be ingesting VIIRS, thermal hotspots, and understanding if forests are burning, and we can be updating and checking on treatment progress and all sorts of things from a spaceborne perspective, right? The next level, can we see it from an airborne perspective? Okay, well, now it's going to be less frequent, but can we harmonize these data, right? And then we start to think about some of the other innovations around cell phone and iPad, et cetera, based technologies, ground-based LiDAR, et cetera. And so as we're thinking about those different buckets of observations, the solutions are different, because the frequency of those data are different, the spatial footprint of those data are different, et cetera, et cetera. And so I see so much innovation in this space that makes me really excited, but we can't see everything. We absolutely can't. LiDAR is really bad. So that's, basic lasers bouncing off of trees and leaves and things like that, right? It's really bad at seeing the understory, which is actually a very large predictor of red style, like early predictor of deforestation. It's not that we can't totally see it, but we can't see it with a level of confidence that we can say, there's a tree there. And so I think the most exciting part of this ecological data revolution is that we're getting better and better at all of this stuff all the time. We're never going to be able to see everything, but I've seen so many panel discussions and examples in this conference of innovations like, oh, wow, you're doing like species level detection from your phone? That is so cool. And in next year at NACW, it'll have progressed a lot more if we think about the pace and scale of machine learning and AI, et cetera, et cetera. Who knows where we're going to be in 10 years? But I just want to make sure that we don't think that we can ever see it all, because even our human eyes can't see it all.
That's true. Okay, so that's the role of tech maybe in helping to mitigate risk. Leslie, I'm curious about the role of financial structures in mitigating risk.
Well, I think going back to the first thing when you asked, like, what risk do I see that maybe others don't, that information asymmetry and then structuring a transaction in a way that ensures both sides have a fair risk-adjusted reward. But I'll mention, I used to trade long-dated derivative options books, so none of what I do today seems as complicated and sophisticated and as innovative as that, although it's a lot harder, I gotta tell you, and I make a lot less money. But anyway, that's okay. I feel good when I go to sleep at night. So on the finance side of things, I'll kind of bucket, like you do good, I like bucketing. I liked your buckets. I might have to use those buckets, and maybe integration of the buckets. So there's on two ways that I will speak about it. One is on blending, which everybody blending this, blending that, blending. But it does help reduce risk. So when we talk about blending, generally in nature-based projects, there's pre-investment blending. So That's some of the stuff that we do when we pay for our own time when we build a business case. It could be that a project had a grant to get prepared, or maybe even start some implementation that then they don't have a long-term income stream unless they somehow access carbon markets. So being able to blend pre-investment, and then we have one project that, for example, it was just under $1 million. It wasn't a lot of money, but without that, the project wasn't bankable. So the risk was it never would have gotten started because it couldn't meet our return threshold. And then in the blending world, we are also trying, we haven't succeeded yet, in blending risk mitigation inside of our fund. So, for example, investors, when they look at coming into our fund, they don't worry that much about delivery risk. It's surprising, but they do worry about price risk. Hey, how am I going to be able to sell these credits and get paid back for my upfront funding? So from the standpoint of if we can blend in, whether it's a guarantee or first loss into our fund, that will allow us to bring more money into the fund and then deploy more money. So that's kind of the blending. And then on the financial structuring side of things, generally, the investments in nature-based solutions, at least the ones we focus on, developing countries, very community-focused, aren't huge. Our average reduction investment is about, which is JRED, avoided conversion to agriculture, log to protected. We don't do much IFM just because we don't do anything timber and it's small credits. But those are $4 million. It's not very much, right? So you can't get super fancy with over-structuring deals. So most of the time, it's a pretty simple, we're going to give this much money and we're going to get paid back in this many carbon credits. And those number of carbon credits are determined based on a risk-adjusted price to the market. So, but we're seeing a bit more interest, especially as there's been more movement to ARR and removals. When you start to see large buyers being willing to commit, then we can start looking at things like principal protected outcome bonds that will take a portion of the issuance and put it into a small number of carbon projects. None of these, there's been the one in Brazil that's done, but there's not been a lot. But those are some of the financial innovations that could help bring more money into the sector. So it's just a lot of comments. Sorry, that was a bit long. But
No, that was fantastic, yeah. Racheal, I want to return to some things you said at the start of our conversation. I want to ask you about project delivery risk. What does this look like? How do you think about it? Is it underappreciated?
I don't think it's underappreciated. I think anyone that's buying credits, that's 100% top of mind for them. At KEDA, we do have a delivery risk insurance policy, and what we break that down is into 3 different groups of types of risks. So the first group is counterparty risk, so fraud, negligence, abandonment, insolvency. So the organization or organizations, if it's across multiple, that's managing, operating, implementing the project. If something goes wrong with them, that's one area on the counterparty risk side. But then there's also the natural catastrophe and the climate change risk side. That's another area that can completely impact delivery risk. Going back to the MBS example, you have a wildfire that does burn down your trees, so now you're going to lose credits. Or you have a drought, so now the trees didn't grow as much, so now you're not going to get as much credit. Which I don't want to underemphasize the fact that natural catastrophes definitely impact engineered removals as well. I mean, think about biochar, anything BECS, where is their supply chain of the organic materials that are coming to the project? So an engineered removal project is in no way just 100% safe from the natural catastrophes as well either. And then the third bucket of risk that we look at within the realm of delivery risk is what we call your carbon risks. So way more niche if the carbon standard goes insolvent or if the carbon standard invalidates the project that you've purchased from. Most likely, if there's a change in methodology, which then changes the amount of credits that can be issued to that project as well. So that's what we look at in terms of overall delivery risk. There is another component that can impact delivery risk, especially if you're doing Article 6.4 transactions or anything under CORSIA, is definitely that political risk component too. But I'll pause there before going political.
Are you sure you want to pause? You don't want to dive in? I don't know. What do you see coming down the pipe for political risk?
No, we can come back to that one, especially if an audience has a question on it.
Okay. All right, then. Well, then I am going to ask you all my last question, and then we will go to audience questions, so get ready. But my last question is, how do we know when we're working too hard to mitigate risks and having an unintended consequence?
Can I go first?
You
Yeah,
can go
do it.
first. Go for it.
Okay, well, we talked about reputational risk. So in my opinion, the standards shall be unnamed, that the pendulum swung way, way, way too far in changing standards to, I guess, protect or repair reputational damage that came from some pretty ill-conceived media players. So for me, that, yes, we want to continue to invest in our standards, in our quantification, to be as accurate, and when we can't be accurate, to be conservative. But when the actions of changing standards make it so that you can't deploy capital, or make it so that projects fail because they have to change their route, their road, not even that their credits aren't going to be the same amount of credits. I mean, that's another issue, but that they just can't get to issuance in time, and that they're delayed for such a long time, even if you've built in 6 to 8 months of extra cash flow, and now all of a sudden you're a year later and you don't have any credits, and the only way these projects survive is through credit sales. So I guess I would say that's where we, the grand we, went way overboard, and it's had really some unintended negative consequences for all of us, the planet, for goodness sake. So that's why I wanted to go first.
Yeah, well, I think I have a good follow-on to that. Did
Please,
you have a
go
follow-on
ahead.
question? Yeah, so I've been talking a lot about some of the dynamic performance benchmark and some of these like newer innovations in this marketplace, and we've been talking about that risk trade-off, but I think there's another component here, which is that these styles of approaches are more and more complex, right? And therefore you need Earth observations, you need a lot more expertise in-house in order to complete them. And I see people in the tech space, entities rising to that challenge to help. But I think that we have to constantly weigh, like as an author of a dynamic performance benchmark methodology, what is constantly in my mind is what is the balance between people being able to understand and implement this and getting it right? Because I could get it perfect, and I could do a full synthetic control of every pixel of everything on the planet, and who else is going to be able to do that, right? I'm not saying I can do that, in my dreams, right? Alternately, how can we create a framework that is usable, that we build statistical rigor into, that people can read and hopefully, let me know in April when it's out for public comment, understand. Like, that's the goal. And so I think when we're thinking about over-indexing on risk management, if the answer is get it perfect, that doesn't exist. So we have to get it close enough.
Yeah, completely agree. And I want to emphasize what Katharyn said in the beginning is this is life. There's always risk. You cannot get to 0% risk. All you can do is understand, manage, minimize, and define what your acceptable level of risk is. And that's going to vary from player to player in the voluntary carbon market. You have to have that conversation within your team and define what that acceptable level of risk is. No one can really set it for you. So I think that's a huge drawback to, especially early stage project investment, is when companies want no risk, or they want to push all of that risk onto the project developer as well, because that's also not the way to go about things. So accept the fact that there is risk, manage it, minimize it, and live with it, and find the right tools to support you in that decision.
Well, and then I want to add on, because, and this is a real world example where we did have, as both an investor and as supporting the development of a project, the off-taker said that we had to guarantee 70% of the delivery. That's a lot. I mean, hopefully we don't have to worry about that, but we nor the underlying investee are going to take that risk, right? So we go to we have someone to talk to in insurance, finally, after years and years, and we price in what is a reasonable price across the different insurers, the cost of the insurance to get rid of that risk. And it turns out that it's ARR project, it's $9 to $11 per ton for a 10 vintage year contract. And that makes it sound like I'm criticizing the pricing on insurance. I'm not, but it adds up. Because if you don't have an ARR project issued till year 2 or year 3, then that's your first issuance, and you might have had a $70 million total 10-year contract. Okay, so you deliver $5 or $10 million worth. Okay, so now you only have to insure $60 million, and it adds up because it's a long time. And even though when you look at the kind of risks you take, I don't look at those the per year cost and say it's not fair, but it adds up. Like, and I'm thinking, really, do they really need a 70% guarantee? And I can understand, I mean, I think the perspective is they're a corporate, they've got their net zero, and if they're not gonna get their tons, they're not gonna be able to make and report their net zero. So I can see both sides of it. But that's a lot of money that doesn't go, I mean, it goes to the infrastructure and the people that take on that risk, because this project could fail, and you might have to pay out. But it's a lot of money that doesn't go down to the ground. Right, so, anyway, I thought I'd bring that example up because it kind of fits in that category of over. And that was, and please, I'm not saying that the insurance company is doing anything wrong, but it does add up, so.
I'll just really quickly add on that. That is a perfect example, is what I was just saying, of pushing the risk entirely onto the supply side, entirely onto the project developer side, where whoever this corporate is, why aren't they sharing that risk with the project developer, or why aren't they the ones getting the insurance policy instead if that specific risk is what really matters to them? So I think that's a perfect example.
How are we doing on time? Okay. I have so many more things to ask you all, but I'm going to give our audience a chance to ask you some questions first. So, would anybody yeah, we don't have a movable mic, so just speak up.
Hi, Timothy Gillette from Puro. So I help my suppliers achieve certification, and Puro certifies engineered carbon removals. So I have a question, because I encountered this problem once with my suppliers, is how do you navigate risk, and how do you navigate a project, a supplier it's his first project ever, and he needs to be attractive to a buyer, to an investor, etc. How do you minimize that risk for a first project ever?
Racheal, do you want to start?
Yeah. A couple of things that they can do. So one of the things that I've learned from our underwriting team, the ones that have the insurance background, is for exactly those new, smaller project developers where they don't have a track record of experience. But in the voluntary carbon market, obviously that's like most project developers by number rather than by volume of credits. So one, I think that's when someone is concerned about that, I generally think that they're probably new to the voluntary carbon market and don't yet understand how it works. Another thing, though, is that, like I was saying, what I've been learning from the underwriting team is that there are proxy data that you can use borrowing from other markets and basically understanding, the official term is a SME, in terms of what is the actual risk on them. So using proxy data sets in the insurance side, that's been really helpful for us to really understand, is that small new product developer actually a risk, or is it, that's just it, they're small and they're new, give them a chance, you know? And then other things that you can do, KETA does a pre-validation feasibility stage risk assessment. That one of the things that we do is we look at the commercial structure of project developers, understand their financial health, their experience, and we benchmark it against other project developers in the space to kind of get that assessment on how the project developer may do. So that's also something that KETA does to help with that market education component.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Yes, please.
Hi, John Anderson, Director of Forest Policy with Humboldt and Mendocino Redwood Companies, large timber landowner in Northern California. First of all, I told my colleague I'm going to bail out of this panel in a half hour because I got this big project over my head that's due today, but you got me hooked. So, and I just wanted to also comment on, I have to make a stab for the forester saying, hey, sometimes you just can't get all the information. You have to have someone on the ground, and as a registered professional forester, spending many times, every acre is different, right?
Yep.
And so hire a few foresters and get that last bit of information. But my main question to you is, we have a number of forest carbon projects, and we hear all the time the criticisms of the buffer pool, and with wildfires happening, that buffer pool is going down. I'm not sure that's true. I've read some articles that said that's not the case. Maybe even ARB has said that. But I'm just curious, that dynamic, seeing that buffer pool go up and down, does that play into how much risk you consider for projects as a whole, even forest projects?
I'm happy to.
Katharyn, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So I have like a question back at you as an answer. Wouldn't it be rad if we were including annually updated wildfire risk in our risk reduction as we issue credits? Like, there are tools we can bring to bear from this ecological data revolution. And by the way, totally agree. We're never going to not have someone in the forest. Like, people like to say that, but like, I remain unconvinced for all the reasons that we were talking about, what you can't see. But I think that there's an opportunity here to be adjusting our risk and our buffer pool dynamically in ways that mimic what we're trying to do with baselines now. If it is a really high drought year in California, or at least actually it's a little bit of a lag. If it was a very dry winter, you get a summer fire season that's extreme. That risk is dynamic. So how do we first not be putting too much in a buffer that is actually robbing projects of the necessary funds, but also, to your point, how do we make sure we have enough? And I think part of the how do we make sure we have enough is also in the integrity of the projects that get developed, right? Where, much like I was saying, if we're keeping an eye on forest structures that are resilient to wildfire, are resilient to drought, are not overstocked, those should be resilient, and therefore, enough credits to not have to be drawing from the buffer. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. You have a wall of active canopy fire headed at a project. It's actually often, there's a lot of remote sensing evidence here that you do see that change in fire behavior, not all the time, but it often takes at least some distance to change that fire behavior. So nothing is ever permanent, but I do think that there's different and novel ways to think about our buffer pool and our project design together. Does that make sense and answer your question?
Junior forestry wings, that was awesome.
Okay, thank you.
And I would add,
I totally agree, not only with the condition of the forest, but also geographically, where are you in the state? Right?
Exactly.
Are you in the southern Sierras where, you have lightning commonly and low humidities and wind versus Eureka and Humboldt County?
100%.
Very different.
well, and the standards are set up to do that. They don't do that in the way they could. They're not as granular as they could be. They look over a much longer time period, so they don't do that. At least for catastrophic risks, they don't do that, what you're suggesting. I mean, one thing that I'm a bit surprised, so talking to Vera, they have 70 million tons in their buffer pool. But they've recently, within the last year and a half maybe, taken and required that if you have a avoidable reversal, which is not fire, but you have an avoidable reversal, as a project proponent, you can't issue any more credits, not only from that project, but any other project your name is on as a proponent, until you've completely topped up the buffer pool. Now, so that's an example of shifting back to the project or the proponent, the risk, right? And I think if they had defined avoidable loss as not such a really broad thing, because for a JRED project, a jurisdictional RED project, somebody going out and cutting down to cook their food while you're trying to address that's they call that avoidable. So I guess my point about the whole thing is I think these buffer pools have a lot of tons in them, but I would love to see some actual, you guys probably could do it, some sort of actuarial analysis, if that's what it's called, on, whether they have enough for both, catastrophic type of natural risks, as well as what would be typically expected for avoidable risks. Because then they should, I think they should be talking to you guys and insure the pool, right? They should say, hey, and they tell the ICVCM, don't worry, we've got permanence covered because X amount is in our pool. We reassess it all the time. And we've worked with these amazing, insurers. And so we know that we can withstand and have environmental integrity for all the projects that we're issued credits for.
I'll jump in on that really quickly and just say that absolutely, Kita would love to do that. We had the resources to do that. We're in conversations with multiple different standards, working on approaches towards that. But again, going back to nothing is a silver bullet, even though we're an insurance company, we don't want insurance to be the single solution because that doesn't work for everyone all around the world. So again, building off of what these two have been saying, it's all about the blended approaches. So absolutely, we want to bring insurance to help buffer pools do better calculations on how many credits projects should be contributing, but insurance is not the silver bullet either.
But you guys would be like the residual risk, like, if they've done theirs and they've, kept them at the right level, you'll know what the tail of that looks like. So it's a combination of those two things.
Yes, yes.
So, and of course, somebody does have to ultimately pay for the insurance, but I can tell you at 27 cents a ton. Anyway, no more comments on that.
Okay, we have time for another question. Okay, we'll get to both of you. Racheal, do you want, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Racheal with CNOT. I have a question on market shifts that I feel like are largely a response to risk. So we see a lot of buyers and even like, net zero frameworks and things shifting from don't purchase AUD or IFMs, shift to purchasing ARR, or don't purchase NBS. Sorry, I'm using too many abbreviations.
That's okay, we're
But
following,
we're
sadly.
following,
credits to removal nature-based credits, or shift from nature-based credits to technology-based removals credits. And I'm wondering if that sort of simplified response to try to avoid risk is actually opening themselves up to larger risks that they're just not aware of because, all these avoided deforestation and IFM projects have been around for a much longer time.
I'm going to say just one quick thing, and then, so the one shift you mentioned from looking at nature-based reductions to not looking at them and only doing removals, and we know which corporates have led that over the last, 3-4 years. The biggest risk, there's not going to be any forest left, and you can't replant them, right? So I know that's kind of like a, the throw-out answer, but I have to bring it up because that's the thing that scares the hell out of me.
I plus one that, because I think, my answer to that is like, what is the risk of no action, right? And so we're pretty obsessed with the risk of an individual project, but we failed to zoom out and ask ourselves, what is the risk of not doing anything at all? And it's kind of, I think actually you said it quite well, Leslie. It's sort of nature-based solutions, in my mind. I mean, don't get me wrong, you all have figured out that I really love forests. So I think at a minimum, it is a bridge technology that is absolutely essential in order to keep us like in some type of ppm 2.5 or ppmv of carbon dioxide equivalent in the atmosphere that allows for other technologies to come into play. Trees have had like a 3.8 billion year lead on us, right? They figured it out. They figured out how to sequester carbon dioxide. It's not perfect, but we can't ignore it either, right?
Okay, last question of NACW. Go ahead.
Of the whole thing. This is
So
the end of
this
the
is
end
it.
of the
So
end.
it better be pretty good.
No pressure.
Hey, I'm Jonathan, Terraformation. We're a native reforestation developer. I think it almost feels like we're being gaslighted here because this is an impossible task where people are saying, and we're all working together in this, let's drive the risk to zero as close as we can, when in reality, the risk of doing nothing is already zero, right? And so if trading between the two, to your point, Katharyn, people will just choose to do nothing. In financial markets, there's actually a cost to doing nothing, right? Which doesn't exist in our market today. Are there things that you're seeing or doing, or things that the rest of us can be doing to increase the other side of the risk equation to then drive people to take action, in the work that we're doing?
That's a good closing question.
I have one idea.
Okay.
So I think the risk of no action is actually most felt in other markets in other ways. Example being watershed health and drinking water. You know, high severity fires, a lot of debris flow ending up in a reservoir that you have to dredge. Like, a lot of that risk of no action is actually felt in other markets. In my opinion, I haven't really seen it bear in this one.
I wish I had an answer for you. I mean, I think if we continue to, I mean, we've been doing this for almost 20 years, right? It's a really long time, and some people are newer in the market, and some people have been around for a long time. Things go up and down, but they are definitely, even though they've been down, like, price-wise and volume-wise since 2022, there are more participants in the market. There are more people. There are the new developers coming in that maybe it's hard for them to get their first sale done. But I guess it sounds very Pollyannish, but we just got to keep doing our job, and haters be damned. And I'm going to keep saying that. That's
Yes.
my expression. I'm not going to
Amen.
give it up. Haters be damned. So,
Racheal, how are we going to increase the risk of doing nothing?
We decrease the risk of doing nothing?
how are we going to make it
No,
so,
I think
yeah,
we wanna
people
put the
see the
pressure
risk
on.
of doing nothing, yeah.
Okay. Honestly, I feel like Leslie had the perfect ending comment. So I'll just throw it out there. It's all about the mentality. I used to work at South Pole. Nick Astor, one of the marketing directors, he always said, and it haunts me in my dreams, honestly, where I'm just like, he's always said, stop throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I think that really underscores what Leslie is saying. And I think the component with that is market education around risk in terms of, again, like I said, risk isn't this one big magnanimous thing. And a lot of companies try and say, like, reputational risk. Reputational risk is just a bundle of specific risks. So within reputational risk, what is the thing that you're concerned about? Break it down to there. Do what you can. Try and have a third party look at it so that if something does go wrong, you can say, look, I did absolutely, I possibly could at the time the decision was made.
Okay, haters be damned.
Haters
Thank you
be
for
damned.
coming.